There's a version of you that handles things. It shows up on time, says the right things, reads the room, manages the distance in relationships with precision. Close enough to feel connected, far enough to stay safe. It's competent, often impressive. And if you pay attention to it long enough, you'll notice something. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with how much you've slept. Most people who feel this describe it in the same approximate language. A sense of going through motions, of watching themselves from a slight distance, present but not quite inhabiting the moment, of functioning well and feeling underneath that functioning, oddly absent. The clinical word for this is depersonalization. But Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, the British pediatrician and psychoanalyst who spent 4 decades observing mothers and infants with the patience of a scientist and the attention of a poet, would have called it something more precise: the experience of living predominantly from the false self. Notice whether any of these land. You're good at anticipating what others need, but genuinely uncertain what you need. You can be warm, engaged, even funny in a room full of people, and then arrive home and feel nothing in particular. Not relief, not pleasure, just a kind of neutral. Intimacy pulls you and threatens you simultaneously. Solitude is not restful. It has an edge to it, like something you're supposed to be doing but can't name. These aren't character flaws. They're not signs that you haven't tried hard enough. They are, according to Winnicott, structural. And the structure has a specific origin. This is where his framework diverges most sharply from everything you've likely heard about childhood. The popular version goes, things happened to you when you were young. Those things shaped you. And now you have to process them. The implied model is trauma as discrete event. What Winnicott found, watching hundreds of mother-infant pairs across decades of clinical practice, was something both simpler and harder to pin down. The adult you became was shaped not primarily by what happened, but by the quality of the emotional environment in which you developed. Not the events, the atmosphere, not the dramatic ruptures, the texture of the ordinary. What Winnicott identified is that the self is not something you're born with whole. It's something that either gets the conditions to emerge or doesn't. The question of who you are today is inseparable from the question of whether the environment that held you early on was responsive enough to let the real you come forward, or whether it required you to build a self that could function in that environment at the cost of never being quite fully alive inside it. That second kind of self works. It may have gotten you very far. What it cannot do is make you feel that your life belongs to you. Start with what most developmental psychology gets wrong. The assumption built into nearly every conversation about childhood is that what forms us are the peaks, the moments of intensity, the incidents we can remember and recount. Winnicott looked at the same data and saw something different. The peaks matter less than the baseline. What shapes the architecture of a person is not what occasionally happened, but what consistently was. He called it the facilitating environment. The term is precise, not a good environment, not a loving one necessarily, but one that facilitates, that actively makes possible the natural unfolding of the infant's developmental processes. Winnicott was careful here. The environment doesn't create the child's potential. That potential is already there, inherited, waiting. What the environment does is either allow it to move forward or interrupt it. And the interruptions don't have to be violent to be consequential. The core of what an infant needs from this environment, Winnicott described as holding. Not metaphorically, though it becomes a metaphor, but literally first. The way a mother holds a body communicates something before language exists to carry it. You are safe, you are continuous, the world is not going to shatter. From that physical fact, something psychological is built. Winnicott called it going on being, the infant's unbroken sense of existing across time, undisturbed by the environment, not forced into reaction. It is the earliest form of what will later become identity. Not who you are, but that you are. That there is a continuous thread of experience that belongs to you. When holding is good enough, going on being develops quietly, almost invisibly. The infant doesn't register it because there's nothing to register. No impingement, no shock, no demand that pulls attention outward. In the maturational processes and the facilitating environment, Winnicott makes a point that deserves to sit with you. It is axiomatic that when things go well, the infant has no means of knowing what is being properly provided. The environment that works disappears into the background. Only failure becomes visible. This is why so many adults struggle to locate what shaped them. The wounds that go deepest aren't always the ones that left a story behind. They're the ones encoded in the baseline, in the texture of how the environment responded to your existence, day after day, before you had the language or the cognitive development to categorize what was happening. You don't remember the atmosphere. You became it. Here's where that becomes something you can use. Think about your relationship to spontaneity, not in the dramatic sense, but in the small, daily sense. When you want something, do you know it directly, or do you arrive at it sideways, after first checking whether it's reasonable, whether it will be well received, whether wanting it says something unflattering about you? That filtering process, that automatic calibration of desire against anticipated response, is not a personality trait. It is a learned adaptation to an environment that, in some consistent way, required your impulses to be managed before they were expressed. The holding was imperfect. The going on being was interrupted enough times that a monitoring function developed in its place. What interrupted it, specifically, and what that produced in you? That's where the map becomes precise. And to read it, you need to understand what was supposed to happen when the environment got things right. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Winnicott was insistent on a point that sounds counterintuitive until you sit with it. The perfect mother would be a catastrophe, not a figure of speech, a clinical claim. An environment that anticipates every need before the infant can gesture toward it, that eliminates every frustration before it registers, produces an infant who never has the experience of reaching and finding. And that experience, reaching, expressing, and being met, is precisely how the true self comes into existence. The good enough mother does something more subtle. She meets the infant's spontaneous gesture. The infant reaches, or cries, or turns. Some expression arises from inside, unprompted, and she responds to it. Not perfectly, not every time, but consistently enough that a pattern forms. The infant's inner impulse moves outward, and the world responds as if that impulse had power, as if wanting something were enough to begin receiving it. Winnicott called this the experience of omnipotence, not grandiosity, but something more fundamental. The felt sense that I exist, that my experience originates in me, that the gestures arising from inside me are real and matter. That felt sense is the true self. Not a thing, not a fixed identity, a process. The ongoing experience of being the author of your own inner life, of wanting what you actually want, feeling what you actually feel, without those wants and feelings having to pass through a filter of acceptability first. In the maturational processes and the facilitating environment, Winnicott writes that the true self is linked to the spontaneous gesture, that it has no other origin. It does not emerge from instruction or correction or achievement. It emerges from being met repeatedly in the moment of expression. When this happens consistently enough, something else develops alongside it, the capacity to be alone. Winnicott's formulation here is one of the strangest and most precise things in the whole of psychoanalytic literature. The capacity to be alone, he argued, is founded on the experience of being alone in the presence of someone. The infant, held by an attuned mother who makes no demands, gradually learns to exist in its own experience without requiring anything from the outside. Not reassurance, not stimulation, not performance. The mother's presence is absorbed not as dependency, but as a kind of internalized safety. Eventually, the infant carries that safety inside. It becomes portable. Test this against yourself right now, not in crisis, in ordinary time. When you're alone and unoccupied, with no task to anchor you and no screen to fill the silence, what happens? If there's restlessness, an itch toward distraction, a low-grade discomfort you can't quite name, that is not introversion or temperament. That is the absence of a sufficiently internalized holding environment. The capacity to be alone without anxiety is a developmental achievement, and like all developmental achievements, it depends on what the environment provided early enough. This is the first concrete thing to track. Notice when you're performing versus when you're present, not in the grand sense, in the granular one. There are moments in ordinary conversation when you're genuinely there, when what you say arises directly from what you're experiencing. And there are moments when you're slightly ahead of yourself, composing, managing, monitoring how you're landing. The gap between those two states is not a matter of social skill. It's the gap between the true self moving and the false self managing. Once you can feel the difference, you can begin to ask what triggers the shift. What triggers it, in most cases, is a specific kind of environmental failure, one that happened long before you had words for it. The mother who is not good enough does not, in most cases, ignore her infant. That would be too simple, and Winnicott was not interested in simple. What she does, because of her own anxiety, her own unmet needs, her own false self-organization, is substitute her gesture for the infant's. The infant reaches. Instead of meeting that reach, she responds to something else, to what she needs the infant to be, to what she can manage, to what her own internal state requires in that moment. The infant's spontaneous impulse goes unmet, and in its place arrives a demand. Comply with this instead. The infant complies. It has no other option. And in that compliance, repeated, consistent, woven into the ordinary fabric of early life, the false self is born. This is Winnicott's most important clinical observation, and it's worth holding precisely. The false self is not pathology imported from outside. It is the infant's own intelligence turned toward survival. When the environment cannot meet genuine expression, expression becomes dangerous, not dramatically, not consciously, but at the level of repeated experience. The infant learns, before language, before memory, before the capacity for reflection, that what arises spontaneously from inside is not safe to bring forward. So it builds something that is, a self that watches, adapts, anticipates, performs, a self that is exquisitely attuned to the environment's needs because its own needs were never reliably met. That self grows up. It becomes capable, often impressively so. It learns to read rooms, manage relationships, produce results. In the maturational processes and the facilitating environment, Winnicott describes patients with very successful false selves, high-functioning, socially fluent, professionally accomplished, who nonetheless carry the persistent, inexplicable sense that they have not yet started to exist. The defense works too well. The performance is so complete that even the performer loses track of what's underneath it. Recognize it in the specific, not the general. The false self shows up when someone asks what you want for dinner, and you feel a small blankness before defaulting to what seems easiest. It shows up in the relationships where you are endlessly generous and quietly invisible, where you know everything about the other person's interior life, and almost nothing is known about yours. And this feels, on some level, safe. It shows up in the exhaustion that follows social interactions that went well, because performing successfully is still performing. It shows up in the way praise lands strangely, slightly to one side of you, as if it's being received by someone who isn't quite you. None of this is conscious. That's the critical point. The false self does not feel like a mask you put on. It feels like you. The true self, suspended, protected, waiting, doesn't announce its presence. It signals through negatives. The absence of genuine desire, the flatness that follows achievement, the sense that the life you're living is adjacent to the life you're supposed to be living, but you can't locate exactly where they diverge. What you can locate is the pattern of what depletes you versus what restores you. False self-activity, performing, adapting, managing, costs energy even when it succeeds. True self-activity, moments of genuine absorption, spontaneous expression, unself-conscious engagement, returns it. This is not about introversion or extroversion. It's about whether the self that is acting is the one that actually lives inside you. Start tracking that distinction this week in the ordinary moments. Which interactions leave you feeling more yourself, and which leave you feeling like you've been somewhere without going anywhere? The specific texture of your false self, what it protects against, what it cannot tolerate, what it most reliably does, was shaped by the particular way your environment failed. And those failures leave recognizable signatures. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Different environments fail in different ways, and the failures are not interchangeable. The adult shaped by an anxious parent carries a different architecture than the adult shaped by a narcissistic one, and both are different from the adult shaped by emotional unpredictability or chronic absence. Winnicott was not interested in typologies for their own sake, but he understood that the shape of the false self is a direct imprint of the shape of the environmental failure. To read one is to read the other. The anxious parent, not malicious, often deeply loving, fails by being too present in the wrong way. The child's expression is constantly met with the parent's worry, their need to fix, their inability to tolerate the child's distress without immediately moving to eliminate it. What the child learns is that its own emotional states are events that require management, that feeling something strongly is a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be had. The adult this produces is often highly competent in a crisis and strangely at sea in calm. They know how to mobilize, they don't know how to rest. Stillness feels like waiting for something to go wrong, because for a long time, it was. The narcissistic parent fails differently. Here, the child's inner life is not met with anxiety, but with redirection toward the parent's needs, the parent's narrative, the parent's emotional requirements. The child learns to locate its own value entirely through its usefulness to others. It becomes expert at reading what people need and providing it, and in doing so, loses, gradually, thoroughly, the thread back to its own wanting. The adult this produces often can't answer the question, "What do you want?" without first calculating what answer will be acceptable. They experience their own desires as somehow illegitimate, as if wanting for themselves is a form of taking from someone else. Unpredictability produces a third signature, perhaps the most destabilizing of the three. When the environment is sometimes responsive and sometimes not reliably neglectful, not reliably warm, but genuinely inconsistent, the infant cannot build a stable internal model of what the world is like. It remains in a state of hypervigilance, scanning constantly for signals, never able to settle into the assumption that safety will hold. The adult this produces often has a particular relationship to their own perception. They doubt it. They experience something clearly, feel hurt, feel joy, feel certain, and then immediately second-guess themselves. The self-doubt is not intellectual. It was learned at the level of the body, in the period before thought was possible. Winnicott's concept of the capacity to be alone cuts across all three of these patterns and gives you a diagnostic tool you can use right now. Find 20 minutes this week, not to meditate, not to journal, not to do anything productive. Simply be unoccupied. No phone, no task, no background noise. Sit with whatever arises. What you encounter in that space is data. If there is restlessness that quickly becomes intolerable, that is a signal. If there is an immediate impulse to fill the silence with something, anything, that is a signal. If being alone with yourself feels vaguely threatening, as though something might surface that you're not equipped to handle, that is the most important signal of all. It tells you that the internal holding environment is thin, that the sense of safety was never sufficiently internalized, because the external environment that was supposed to deposit it wasn't consistent enough to do the job. None of this means your parents were villains. That framing is too easy, and more importantly, it's not useful. Most of the failures Winnicott described were not acts of cruelty. They were the overflow of the parents' own unprocessed psychology, their own false self, their own thin internal holding environment, their own inheritance from environments that failed them. The chain goes back further than any individual parent, which means the question is not who to blame. The question is something harder and more honest than that. There is a version of Winnicott's framework that gets weaponized. People encounter the concept of the good enough mother, locate the ways their own mother or father or whoever held that function fell short, and arrive at a narrative of damage that is satisfying in its clarity and paralyzing in its effect. The past explains everything. The parent is the cause. The adult is the result. Nothing changes because the origin is fixed. Winnicott would not have recognized this as insight. He would have recognized it as another form of the false self's operation. Organized now, not around compliance, but around a story that keeps the true self safely unavailable. If everything is already explained, nothing is required of you. He drew a distinction that matters here between deprivation and privation. Deprivation is the loss of something that was there, a responsiveness that existed and was then withdrawn, a warmth that the child actually experienced and then couldn't find. Privation is the absence of something that was never provided at all, a need the environment simply never met from the beginning. Both produce suffering, but deprivation, paradoxically, carries something privation doesn't. The child who was deprived knows at some level that something was taken, knows that a different experience was possible. That knowledge, even when it surfaces as rage, as grief, as the antisocial tendency Winnicott spent years studying, is evidence of health. It is the true self's protest. It means the true self exists enough to object. The adult who can locate genuine anger at what they didn't receive is closer to their true self than they might think. Anger, in this specific sense, is not bitterness. It is not the rehearsal of grievances. It is the recognition, clear-eyed, without inflation or minimization, that something was owed and not paid. Parents are not absolved by the fact that they were themselves failed. The chain of transmission is real, and it explains without excusing. Your parents gave you what they had, which was shaped by what they were given, which was shaped further back than either of you can see. That is true. It is also true that you are now the one holding the question of what happens next. This is the place where Winnicott's framework stops being historical and becomes live. Because the holding environment does not end with childhood. Adults continue to need and continue to be capable of providing for themselves the conditions that allow the true self to move. The internal holding environment that was not adequately built externally can be constructed, slowly, through deliberate experience, not through insight alone. Insight is the map. The territory is the actual quality of your moment-to-moment relationship with your own experience. What that construction requires is not the excavation of every early wound. It requires something more specific and more immediate. The capacity to notice when you are operating from the false self, performing, managing, complying, and to introduce, in that moment, even a small deviation. Not a confrontation, not a declaration, a small, genuine gesture toward what you actually want, what you actually think, what you actually feel. Repeated enough times, in enough different contexts, with enough tolerance for the anxiety that genuine expression initially produces in people who learned early that genuine expression was unsafe. This changes the internal architecture. Slowly, structurally. The map Winnicott offers is not a verdict. It's a set of coordinates. You are here, it says, because of this, because the environment that held you had these specific qualities, and your psychology organized itself around them with the intelligence available to an infant who had no other options. That is where you are. Where you go from here is not determined by where you started. There is a question underneath everything Winnicott wrote, one he rarely stated directly, but that animates the whole of his clinical work. Is the process of becoming still open? Not whether you can undo what happened, you can't, but whether the developmental movement that was interrupted or distorted can resume. Whether the true self, however long it has been in suspension, retains the capacity to emerge given the right conditions. His answer, arrived at across decades of work with patients whose early environments had failed them in every conceivable way, was carefully optimistic. The true self does not die. It waits. It signals its presence through the negatives, through the flatness, the unreality, the persistent sense that the life being lived is not quite the right size. And those signals, however uncomfortable, are evidence that something underneath the performance is still alive and still wants conditions in which it can move. The question, then, is what those conditions actually require. And here, Winnicott is more useful than most of his successors, because he refuses to make the answer abstract. The facilitating environment that the true self needs in adulthood is not fundamentally different from the one the infant needed. It requires reliability, the sense that the ground will hold. It requires responsiveness, that genuine expression will be met rather than managed. And it requires what he called the experience of going on being, uninterrupted stretches of time in which you are not performing, not producing, not adapting to anything external, simply existing in your own experience without it being evaluated or redirected. Most adults have almost none of this. The structure of modern life, its productivity logic, its social visibility, its continuous demand for output and legibility, is precisely designed to keep the false self operational. It rewards compliance, it monetizes performance, it mistakes fluency for authenticity and busyness for aliveness. This is not a coincidence. It is an environment, and like all environments, it shapes the self that lives inside it. The work Winnicott described, the slow construction of an internal holding environment, runs directly against the current of nearly everything the external environment will ask of you. So the action this video is asking for is not a mindset shift. It is not a reframe. It is a specific, repeatable practice with a precise function, creating conditions in which the true self can move without immediately being managed back into compliance. Each day, find one moment, one, in which you allow genuine expression without editing it for reception, not in a high-stakes context, not in confrontation, in something small, the preference stated directly instead of deflected, the feeling acknowledged internally instead of immediately rationalized away, the creative impulse followed for 10 minutes without producing anything intended for anyone else. The smallness is not incidental. The true self, Winnicott observed, does not emerge in grand gestures. It emerges in the quality of ordinary moments, in whether the person living them is actually present for them, or managing them from a slight and practiced distance. The distance can close, not through a decision, but through accumulation, through enough moments of genuine presence that the internal environment begins to feel, slowly, like somewhere you can actually live. Winnicott spent his career watching human beings become themselves, or fail to, in the first years of life. What he found was not a fixed story, but a set of conditions. Conditions that could be missed early and created later, imperfectly but meaningfully, by the adult who finally understood what had been missing. That adult is capable of becoming, for themselves, something the early environment could not be. Reliable enough, present enough, responsive enough to let something real come forward. You've just been handed the map. The next video on your screen will take you deeper into the territory. Click and keep going.